I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear
I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
We are transferring power from Washington, D.C., and giving it back to you, the people.
Today is Monday, January 20th, 2025. It is the first day of President Donald Trump's historic second term in office, as he joins Grover Cleveland as the second American president elected to non-consecutive terms. It is also the final day of Joe Biden's first and certainly only term, a term that started with the election of a man by the highest number of votes in history, that led America through a pandemic, major inflation, and ended a foreign war, just to leave with nearly a record-low job approval. As we sit back and prepare for the inauguration, let's take a look back at the last 4 years of the presidency of Joe Biden, a man that seemed built but never destined for the office. Let's examine the ups and, quite literally, the downs of the culmination of the achieved dream of a 13-year-old boy in Delaware and a 50-year career in public service. This is the presidency of Joe Biden. Hello everyone, I'm the President's Guy and welcome to the inaugural episode of The Presidency, the series where we take a look at the significant events, failures, and successes of the men that have occupied the White House. There will be a separate series that will exist for the biographies of these men for their lives before and after the White House. Before we get started, remember to like and subscribe and share this video around if you enjoy it. Now let's get started.
so help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
George Willis compared the presidency to that of a soft leather glove, in that it takes the shape of the hand that's put into it. And this is certainly a fitting analogy. The Constitution is with the presidency, as with many things, vague in its instructions and descriptions of the job. Much of what we know of the role today has largely been shaped by the men that have filled it. It has been expanded, constricted, and grown undoubtedly more powerful in office than even the most centrist of the Founding Fathers would have imagined. I've often found the office and the occupants of it incredibly fascinating. I find myself reading about these men and wondering how they tackled the monumental tasks placed before them. How did Abraham Lincoln handle the Civil War? How did George Washington handle being the first president? How did Harry Truman make the decision to drop the atomic bomb? This series and this channel at large are dedicated to answering just these very questions. When analyzing a presidency, there are distinct chapters and areas of interest one should focus on, and since the days of FDR, the first 100 days and more lately the first day have come under more intense scrutiny and observation. We will then look at domestic policy, including energy, social rights, the economy, and much more, and then get into foreign policy, including NATO, Ukraine and Russia, Israel, and a slew of other things. And we'll cover some miscellaneous topics such as various scandals that have come up, the 2024 campaign, and then we're going to give a final grade to the term, and we're going to discuss the long-standing impacts of Joe Biden's term as president on both the nation and his legacy. Now let's get started with day one. Joe Biden's first day in office got off to a quick pace. After a Jimmy Carter-style walk down Pennsylvania Avenue, Biden got right to work signing a slew of executive orders, well over a dozen in his first day. These would include declaring a National Day of Unity, rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, rejoining the World Health Organization, ending the Keystone Pipeline permits, revoking a number of Trump's environmental policies, halting funding to the border wall, although he would later continue this, extending the pause on student loan debt until September of 2021, and ending the Trump-era travel ban from Muslim nations. Also, a first piece of legislation for his term was introduced, which was an immigration bill proposal that would create an 8-year path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, add new screening technologies, and send aid to Central American countries in an attempt to address the primary reasons that migrants leave in the first place. After day one, Biden showed no signs of slowing. On January 21st, he applied the Defense Production Act for personal protective equipment, and he suspended new natural gas and oil development leases on federal lands and waters. The following day, on January 22nd, he issued an executive order to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour for federal employees. The order sought to do this by requiring that federal contractors pay a minimum wage of $15 an hour and to provide emergency pay leave by the end of Biden's first 100 days in office. It also directed government agencies to determine which federal workers were earning less than that minimum wage and to develop recommendations in order to promote them up to $15 an hour. Biden would issue an executive order that would end the Trump-era transgender military ban, and would sign a further executive order to increase the government buying from U.S. manufacturers, which would alter the rules for the Buy American program, first making it harder for contractors to qualify for waivers and sell foreign-made goods to federal agencies. The order also changed rules so that more of a manufactured goods components must originate from U.S. factories. American-made goods would also be protected by an increase in the government's threshold and price preferences, which in essence is the amount of money the government is willing to overspend compared to a foreign product. On January 26, President Biden issued an executive order to the Department of Justice not to renew its contracts with private prisons. This is likely an attempt to curb the for-profit business model many prisons implement when locking people up. He ended Trump's zero-tolerance border policy, which led to the separations of over 3,000 families at the U.S. southern border. In a statement, Acting Attorney General Monty Wilkinson wrote, quote, "Consistent with this long-standing principle of making individualized assessments in criminal cases, I am rescinding, effective immediately, the policy directive," end quote. Wilkinson would go on to say the department's principals have, quote, "long emphasized that decisions about bringing criminal charges should involve not only a determination that a federal offense has been committed and that the admissible evidence will probably be sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction, but should also take into account other individualized factors, including personal circumstances and criminal history, the seriousness of the offense, and the probable sentence or consequences that would result from a conviction." On January 28th, Biden signed executive orders to expand the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid by instructing the Department of Health and Human Services to open a special enrollment period for the Affordable Care Act through healthcare.gov. The enrollment period ran from February 15th to May 15th. In addition, the order instructs federal agencies to re-examine current policies that may undermine the Affordable Care Act and the health insurance exchanges created under the law. Biden also requested a review of policies that could potentially make it more difficult for Americans to enroll in Medicaid. The second order got rid of the Mexico City policy, also known as the gag rule, which bars international, non-governmental organizations that provide abortion counseling or referrals from receiving U.S. On February 2nd, Biden would sign 3 more executive orders focused on the border and immigration. The first created a task force to reunite children separated from their parents under Trump's zero-tolerance border policy, and the task force was chaired by the Secretary of Homeland Security. The second executive action evaluated legal immigration programs, such as the Central American Minors Program, which allowed certain children from the region to lawfully unite with family members in the United States. Trump ended the program in 2017. The order would also review the Trump administration's Remain in Mexico policy. The third executive order directed the State Department, the Justice Department, and the Department of Homeland Security to review guidelines and policies from the Trump administration to determine if they were in what was called the government's desire to promote, quote, integration and inclusion. Lastly, it initiated a review of the policy known as public charge, which punishes illegal immigrants who use public benefits by potentially limiting access to green cards and of the naturalization process. On February 4th, Biden penned an executive order to increase refugee admissions to 62,500 for the year 2021, and then 125,000 next year in 2022, which is up from the historic low under President Trump of just 15, which was lower from the 110,000 put in place under President Obama. It is worth noting that during 2022, only 26,000 refugees were admitted to the United States. On February 16th, President Biden extended mortgage assistance to the end of June and extended the enrollment window to request a mortgage payment forbearance and granted 6 months of additional forbearance for those who enrolled on or before June 30th. On February 25th, Biden issued his first military action by approving a drone strike in Syria in response to rocket fire in the area of the U.S. Embassy. On March 11th, President Biden signed the first major piece of legislation of his term with the American Rescue Plan. This plan included direct payments of up to $1,400 to most Americans. The bill extended a $300 per week unemployment insurance boost until September 6th and expanded the child tax credit for 1 year. It also put nearly $20 billion to fund COVID-19 vaccinations, $25 billion into rental and utility assistance, and $350 billion into state, local, and tribal relief. The legislation also increased the maximum supplemental nutrition assistance program benefit by 15% through September of that year, and directed almost $30 billion to restaurant aid and more than $120 billion to K-12 schools. The American Rescue Plan additionally boosted provisions to make healthcare more affordable and expand tax credits to help businesses pay their staff. During a news conference at the end of March, Biden would semi-formally make an announcement that he was planning to run for re-election. On the 30th of March, Biden would sign an extension for the Paycheck Protection Program, which was created in 2020 to help small businesses as they dealt with the issues surrounding the pandemic. The deadline to apply was extended from March 31st to May 31st, and extended authorization of loans to June 30th. On April 14th, Biden announced the Afghan withdrawal would be completed by September 11th of 2021, pushing it back from the May deadline set during the Trump administration. We will cover this in more detail later. It was announced on April 21st that 200 million COVID vaccines were given, which was twice the initial goal proposed by that time. And on April 28th, the last of his first 100 days in office, Biden announced the proposal for the next phase of his Build Back Better agenda, which was the American Families Plan. This plan, among many other items, included 4 years of free public college, universal preschool, raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, subsidized child care, extended tax credits for low and middle income earning families, expansions of the Affordable Care Act, and mandatory paid family leave. The legislation ultimately would not pass in this form, although some of its aspects would later be incorporated into future legislation. On the domestic policy front, there are a key number of areas to focus on. The first we will take a look at is the COVID-19 pandemic, as it was ravaging the country when President Biden took office and would become the focal point of much of his. The pandemic was at potentially its worst point when Biden took office in January of 2021. Thousands of people were being hospitalized or dying on a daily basis. And as mentioned earlier, President Biden took many steps in his first 100 days to curb the spread of the disease and to get us out of the pandemic as soon as possible. Let's take a look at some of the actions he took to deal with the crisis after his first 100 days. Thanks in part to President Trump's rhetoric on the disease, calling it the, quote, China virus.
It comes from China.
Chinese and other Asian Americans were facing discrimination and in many cases assault in public because of this. On May 20th, 2021, Biden signed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. It aimed to ease the process of reporting hate crimes by ensuring that reporting resources were available online in multiple languages. It also directs the Department of Justice to, quote, designate a point person to expedite the review of hate crimes related to COVID-19, and authorized grants to state and local governments to conduct crime reduction programs to prevent and respond to hate crimes, end quote. On September 19th that year, the president revealed his path out of the pandemic plan. Despite announcing in July the independence from the virus, and over 200 million Americans receiving at least one COVID vaccine, Biden announced a slew of new vaccine mandate proposals, despite stating during the campaign that he would not. The mandates included required vaccinations for executive branch workers and contractors without an option to skip out by testing weekly, and asked OSHA to implement a mandate for all companies with 100 or more workers to get vaccinated or to test weekly. It also required that all health facilities that receive federal funding require vaccination for their employees. These proposals were announced during a 300% rise in cases and 1,000 deaths per day, despite the vaccination success in the fall of 2021, which many predicted would occur in conjunction with flu season. The announcement of these mandates was a major factor along with the exit from Afghanistan and the decline of Biden's approval ratings, which would start in September of 2021 and lead all the way through the end of his term. On November 3rd of 2021, the vaccine mandates were officially announced, and they were almost immediately blocked by the courts on the 6th of the same month. By January the following year, the Supreme Court sounded off by ruling against the requirement for large companies, but ruled that Biden did have the authority to implement the rules for federal workers and healthcare facilities since they receive federal funding. During the pandemic, COVID-19 deaths reached a peak of nearly 2,500 a day in February of 2021. It would fall precipitously and peak again in September of that year and then February of 2022, before falling off in the months and years since. In terms of vaccination rate, administration peaked at over 3 million doses a day in April of 2021, and would spike again notably in doses given per day after the two previously noted upticks in cases. In the end, 230 million people, or 70% of the U.S. population, were fully vaccinated, with 270 million, or 81%, having received at least one vaccine. A further 33%, or 110 million people from the original group, would get a third or fourth vaccine booster after a well-intended but inaccurately recommended
low risk, low benefit. I mean, you'll buy yourself 3 to 6 months of decreased risk of getting a mild infection. That's what you do, and then you're right back to where you were in terms of preventing mild infection. I don't think a healthy 16-year-old should get another dose of vaccine, assuming they've had 3 doses or 2 doses in a natural infection.
The administration would take a lot of flack for its handling of the pandemic, particularly its censoring of misinformation online. In an attempt to curb those seeking to stop vaccination efforts and to stop the spread of misinformation surrounding various, quote, miracle cures and the 2020 election, posts, comments, and other online activity would be censored, removed, or have notes attached to it to give as accurate advice as possible. This received very vocal criticisms from the public that reviewed the information given as contradictory, such as the message from Dr. Fauci to not wear a mask and then to wear a mask, despite the recommendations being based on each moment in time, and viewed the censorship as a violation of freedom of speech. In Missouri v. Murphy, the Supreme Court ruled against the Biden administration in its handling of contact with social media companies regarding removal of misinformation, although the administration maintained that these were only requests and not demands. Despite some of the actions during the pandemic being labeled as restrictions on free speech and expression, and it should be noted that many of these were taken at the state level, President Biden did take many steps to protect and expand social rights in America. On December 16, 2021, the FDA ended its restriction on abortion pills being sent in the mail, and Biden has been very outspoken about his belief in a woman's right to choose before and during his term. In March of 2022, Biden signed legislation that ends the use of forced arbitration clauses specifically for sexual harassment and sexual assault claims. This gives victims the option of bringing up the dispute in court, and it would also apply retroactively to previously resolved cases unless those cases were currently pending. Later in the year, Biden signed the Speak Out Act, which prevents companies from including sexual harassment or sexual assault non-disclosure agreements in contracts. This essentially being a preemptive measure from companies to prevent liability in the event that their employees commit sexual harassment or sexual assault. Also in December of that year, Biden would sign the Respect for Marriage Act, which sought to codify same-sex marriage into law. This was done in the wake of the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade, which guaranteed the right to an abortion, for fear that the now majority conservative court would overturn the 2015 ruling that same-sex marriages were protected under the Constitution. On the economic front, the results of the past 4 years, despite what many clickbait-titled articles and shock-jock-style journalism would have you believe, the economy has done tremendously well under the Biden administration. Unemployment, which peaked during the pandemic at almost 15% in April of 2020, is now down to around 4%. It is worth noting that unemployment was down to 6.4% in January of 2021. It reached a low under President Biden of 3.4% in 2024. In terms of job growth, 7 million additional jobs, not including those recovered from pandemic losses, have been added during the Biden term. And Biden is also the first president in American history to have positive job growth during every month of his presidency, including more manufacturing jobs being held currently than before the pandemic. It is worth noting many job figures are subject to change as preliminary data becomes more accurate as time passes, and corrections are made and reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, as was an example with corrections made to 2023 figures that showed slight overcalculations in the number of jobs added. In terms of domestic manufacturing, Biden's biggest success has been the CHIPS and Science Act of August of 2022. The bipartisan legislation invests over $50 billion, of which over $40 billion is from international investment, to U.S. manufacturing of semiconductors, including building new manufacturing plants domestically. It is estimated to add about 8,000 jobs and increase the United States global market share of production of semiconductors from 2 to 10%. In January of 2025, Biden would block the sale of U.S. steel to Japanese-owned Nippon Steel, fulfilling a campaign pledge to keep the noted producer. In terms of the stock market, the Dow Jones, the S&P 500, and NASDAQ have all reached record levels. GDP growth is also higher than pre-pandemic levels as of 2023. So like unemployment, these metrics all bottomed down in April of 2020 and were trending upward by the time that Biden did take office. In terms of wages, average hourly wages, median weekly earnings, and disposable income are all up from pre-pandemic levels. Housing is one area where many recent presidents have failed to adequately address the issue. The housing issue was definitely predated Biden, and this is for a variety of reasons, some of which are that people are more concentrated in cities and less in suburban and rural areas than they used to be 20, 30, 40 years ago. The reduced availability of homes combined with the higher interest rates compared to where they were during the pandemic have meant that housing is roughly 40% more expensive now compared to then. It is worth noting that the interest rates for homes reached historic lows during the pandemic, with some going below 2 and 3%. The increase in housing costs have been the primary factor raising the average inflation rate, making it appear worse than it is. Biden unveiled his Housing Supply Action Plan on May 16, 2022, which included such measures as using existing and new funds available, including those from the infrastructure bill, to aid in state and local housing projects. Additionally, $25 billion in grants has been proposed legislatively, with these measures proposed to address the housing shortage by the year 2027. Inflation, as mentioned a moment ago, became one of, if not the focal points of the Biden administration. COVID-19 related supply shortages, increased demand, artificial and opportunistic price hikes from corporations, and loads of government spending all converged to lead to what seemed to be a never-ending cycle of high inflation. Now, it is important to note here that the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 actually does little in terms of reducing inflation outside of medical costs for seniors. It does succeed at being the most poorly named piece of legislation perhaps in recent memory. Inflation, in simple terms, is the rate at which prices increase over time. Positive inflation is actually a good economic indicator. Negative inflation, or deflation, is a sign of harsh economic times to come. But the high inflation seen in the wake of the pandemic created situations that led to constricted financial conditions for millions of Americans, and they looked to their president to solve them. As early as 2021, economists were projecting that a recession would need to occur in order to correct the inflation. In the longer sense, while we saw a great many factors such as jobs and the economy as a whole recover post-COVID-19, the supply chain was permanently damaged by closures of many plants across a number of industries. Lumber, for example, reached record prices in 2022, which only exacerbated the housing shortage. The Fed increased rates, and it was said that unemployment would also need to increase. Inflation peaked at 9.1% in June of 2022 and has steadily declined since then to a low point of 2.4% in September of 2022. This was accomplished at a pace far faster than the rest of our peer nations and without the previously stated events occurring. So why did this not lead to positive results in terms of public opinion toward Biden? Well, simply put, while inflation was down, prices were still increasing as they normally do. Lower inflation does not equal lower prices. It just means that they are going up slower. And many people didn't feel that they recovered from the hikes in 2021 and 2022. It should be noted that some of this was media-driven perception, as housing was the main driving factor in the
last month. That went to 11%, the highest number in 40 years.
Nonetheless, the United States recovered from this high inflation much faster and easier than the rest of the developed world. Biden would spend much of 2024 using various agencies like the FTC to work to ban excessive and hidden fees and to ensure adequate restitution on bank overdrafts, airline fees such as those to seat your family together, and cancellation of flights being in cash and not just airline credit, and more to save American consumers from these gross overcharges. On the front for Social Security, Biden has made constant assurances to protect the program. In the beginning days of January of this year, he signed the Social Security Fairness Act, which seeks to aid 2.5 million Social Security recipients like teachers, firefighters, and social workers by eliminating a couple of old provisions. Social Security beneficiaries will receive monthly increases in some cases of several $100s and will receive lump sum payments to make up for lost back pay due to these old provisions. A major subsection of Biden's economic policy was his plan for student debt relief. This was one of the focal points of his 2020 campaign, and he promised a sweeping program to cancel student debt for low and middle income families. Let's take a look at the actions he took to try and achieve this ambitious goal. From June to July of 2021, the Biden administration canceled $1.5 billion in student debt. This instance involved students who were defrauded by for-profit schools. Many of the borrowers first filed under the Trump administration but were denied when then Secretary of Education DeVos altered the calculations for forgiveness. As mentioned during his first 100 days, Biden extended the pause on student loan payments until May 1st of 2022, and he did this on December 2nd, 2021. Under Biden's proposed debt relief program, which he unveiled in August of 2022, $10,000 to $20,000 would be forgiven per qualifying person. This reportedly would have aided 43 million Americans and would have totally eliminated all student debts for approximately half of the applicants. In July of 2023, the Supreme Court ruled that the program did not comply with the HEROES Act. The HEROES Act, which was the law being used to pause student loan payments, gives the Secretary of Education the power to waive or modify laws and regulations governing the student loan programs. And according to the decision, Congress's use of the word modify means that the Biden administration can make, quote, modest adjustments and additions to existing provisions, but, quote, not transform them. The debt relief program, Chief Justice Roberts stressed, instead, quote, created a novel and fundamentally different loan forgiveness program, end quote. After this major setback, President Biden began exploring other avenues for student debt cancellation. A few notable examples include on July 14th of 2023, it was announced that $39 billion for 804,000 borrowers would be canceled through corrections in years of administrative mistakes, such as mispayments or miscalculations. Biden also initiated the SAVES program and PSLF, which was the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, of which 1 million people benefited under Biden compared to just 7,000 people before. October 14, 2023, $9 billion was canceled for 125,000 borrowers through a variety of programs, including public service workers and payment for more than 10 years, general borrowers and payment for more than 20 years, or those with disabilities. $5 billion would be canceled in both December of 2023 as well as the beginning of 2024, mostly through the SAFE plan, most of these being borrowers with less than $12,000 in outstanding debt and have been paying for more than 10 years. An additional $1.2 billion would be canceled under the SAVE plan in February of that year, and in March of that year, $6 billion would be canceled for public service workers. Another $7 billion for 277,000 borrowers through the SAVE plan would be canceled in 2024. In May of 2024, 160,000 borrowers would have a total of $7.7 billion canceled. This round of assistance came for public servants like teachers and police, as well as tens of thousands of more people who have signed up for the SAVE program. And to briefly explain the program, it's essentially it ties your payments based on your income instead of just making it based on the loan. This is kind of designed to lower the burden of the monthly payments and to kind of help some of the earlier repayment programs that will just kind of let the interest snowball over time and making the payments just unreasonable for most people. In summation, Biden has forgiven, as of December of 2024, $180 billion in student loans, and this has benefited about 5 million people. Now, of course, this fell well short of his original proposal, but in no doubt is a welcome benefit for those that he was able to help. Moving towards more renewable energy was definitely a major platform of the Biden campaign. Leases that were awarded in February of 2022 for offshore wind farms set energy records, and this was for 6 wind farm sites that would total $4.37 billion in contracts. On April 15th of that year, they would increase the oil royalty from 12% to 18.75%, which was the first increase of its kind in about 100 years. The royalty rate being the fee that the federal government collects. This move is likely to incentivize production towards cleaner energy sources. In August 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act invested about $369 billion in clean energy, including 30% tax breaks for those that install solar panels into their homes. Biden came under heavy fire in March of 2023 for the Willow Project, which was an oil drilling site in Alaska with the ConocoPhillips Corporation, which is the only company with drilling rights in that particular area. It was originally approved under the Trump administration for 5 sites. The Biden administration took this down to 3. They didn't reject the project entirely because they felt the courts would just end up overturning the decision, given that the company had a pre-existing presence in the area. Regardless, this certainly sparked outrage among environmental groups. Although he would cancel the remaining Arctic Wildlife Refuge oil leases in the area that were made in the waning days of Trump's term, but never actually got underway, and they were canceled in September of 2023. He would also propose additional protections to the area to help protect it from future oil drilling. In September of 2023, energy production was at an all-time high, with almost 13 million barrels of oil being produced each day. More energy was created from January 20, 2021 to this point during Biden's term than was in the entirety of the previous 4 years. This is likely due, however, to decreased production in 2020. It should also be noted that this likely had nothing to do with Biden's actual policies, but just instead general industry innovation and more efficient techniques being developed that were underway all the way back to 2014. It, however, failed to make major inroads at the time on gas prices, as OPEC and Saudi Arabia noted it was still increasingly more expensive for them to produce oil, which kept the prices high. Near the end of Biden's term in January of this year, he announced major permanent bans on new oil drilling leases on the entire East Coast, the eastern Gulf of Mexico, the coast of Washington, Oregon, California, and parts of Alaska's northern Bering Sea. This totaled in all 625 million acres. Biden noted the risks to the coastal communities just were simply not worth the potential gains. Of course, we could all harken back to the days of 2009 and 10 during the major BP oil spill. The action uses a 1953 law that gives the president authority to withdraw lands, but requires congressional approval to re-implement them, which would make it harder to reverse this decision in the future. In a related area to energy and inflation, high gas prices became a particular point of criticism for the Biden administration. Gas prices became incredibly low during the peak of the pandemic due to very low demand and a lot of travel restrictions. During this time, many production facilities would close and permanently never reopen. So when prices began to rebound in 2021, they went far past their pre-pandemic levels. This compounded with the Russian-Ukrainian war, leading to Russia, which was at the time the world's third largest oil producer, to essentially be blacklisted by the rest of the world, leading the prices to reach a national average of $5 a gallon in June of 2022. Biden did take some steps to curb this increase. In March of 2022, he called for the release of oil from the National Strategic Reserve of about 1 million barrels a day for 6 months. At the time, they didn't know how much this would help, but they projected anywhere from a 10 to 45 cent decrease. He then called to suspend the gas tax temporarily in June of 2022, which was a step that was taken somewhat successfully on many state levels. This measure sought to relieve gas prices by about 18 cents a gallon by keeping the tax paused for 3 months. The average gas price by March of 2023 had fallen to a national level of about $3.50 per gallon, and as of December of 2024 had fallen below $3 a gallon. Despite all these actions, gas prices continue to be a talking point among many of those opposed to President Biden. Infrastructure has been a long-discussed area of focus in American politics. Dating back to the 19th century, the political parties were divided on just such an issue, and their times calling it internal improvements, and arguing whether or not taxes should be levied to fund such works, if the local, state, or federal authorities were the proper bodies to do such, or even if they should happen at all. Major infrastructure projects have defined presidencies in the past, such as President Eisenhower's highway project. The main area in recent times has been to simply repair what we have. There seem to be a never-ending number of stories about bridge collapses, poorly managed roads filled with potholes, weather-destroying power grids, such as the case in Texas during unprecedented cold fronts, and a need to update and expand such areas as high-speed internet and, again, the power grid. Well, President Biden made major inroads in this area on November 15, 2021. The bipartisan infrastructure bill totaled about $1 trillion. The legislation included $550 billion in new funding for transportation, utilities, and broadband expansion. It allocated $110 billion to roads, bridges, and other major projects, and gave $66 billion toward railway improvements and about $40 billion into public transit. It put $55 billion toward water systems, including lead pipe replacements. The installation of thousands of electrical vehicle charging stations were also a major part of the bill. It is estimated the law will create about 700,000 jobs annually over the next 10 years. Specifically, $65 billion will be invested in expanding broadband access, which many, particularly in the South and places such as Georgia and Tennessee, have already seen examples of people who previously didn't have access to high-speed internet having it become available to them. Specifically, $65 billion will be invested in expanding broadband access, which many, particularly in the South and places such as Georgia and Tennessee, have already seen examples of people who previously didn't have access to high-speed internet having it become available to them. Much of this improvement comes from an agreement that Biden made in May of 2022 with 20 different internet providers as a part of the Affordable Connectivity Program. This sat to reduce or eliminate provider fees for families at or below 200% of the poverty line by providing $30 reductions as part of the infrastructure law. Many of the internet providers also agreed to lower their monthly cost to $30 a month, essentially making it free for low-income households, and to double their speeds for their customers. This program ended in June of 2024. In April of 2022, Biden signed the Postal Service Reform Act. This law sat to completely reform the Postal Service, which had seen nearly 15 straight years of losses and poor structure linked back to the 2006 Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act. The law aimed to completely reform, approved under the Bush administration. The law also restructured the investment that the Postal Service makes in retired employee health plans and adds Medicare requirements. It also requires that the Postal Service deliver 6 days out of the week, meaning it can't cut services in the future, and it creates an online dashboard with weekly updates on the on-time delivery rate for everywhere in the United States. You may have noticed daily emails telling you what mail to expect each day. The law also lets the Postal Service provide non-postal services by working with state and local governments for obtaining things like hunting and fishing and driver's licenses. It also would reduce mailing fees for newspapers in rural areas. The President signed the Ocean Shipping Reform Act in June of that year, which aimed to reduce shipping costs to aid American consumers, especially after the exponential increases during 2020 of up to 1,000% for shipping. On August 16th, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, which among many items increased funding for the IRS by $80 billion over the next 10 years to aid the agency, which had complained about underfunding for years. As previously mentioned, the law did make investments in clean energy and also into healthcare, which will be covered in a later section. During a shortage of baby formula in 2022 that was caused by closing of several production facilities due to health concerns, Biden implemented the Defense Production Act again to make and distribute formula throughout the nation. This required other manufacturers to fill orders to reduce bottlenecking and to authorize military flights to import more. The Electoral Count Reform and Transition Act was signed on December 23rd of 2022 as part of a 2023 appropriations bill which would be signed on the 29th. The law corrects the Electoral Count Act of 1887 by clearly defining the roles in the certification process. This was a bipartisan piece of legislation which named governors as the sole officials responsible for submitting the state's presidential electors unless otherwise named by state law. It also provided for expedited judicial review of certain claims related to state certification and identifying presidential electors. The law also stipulates that the vice president's role in presiding over the counting of electoral votes is strictly ministerial and that he or she could not have the power to decide questions related to the electoral count vote. This obviously comes after the controversy of the 2020 election, in which President Trump inaccurately stated that the vice president had the ability to overturn the election results. The law also raised the threshold of members of Congress to object to a state's electors from one member of each house, as noted here during 2017 of President Biden, then vice president, certifying the 2016 election results, to 1/5 of the members of both houses of Congress. The law also states that if a candidate does not concede by 5 days...
A signature from a senator is required. Is there a signature from a senator?
There is a signature from the House of Representatives, myself.
The objection cannot be received without a signature from the senator.
Mr. President, I object
to 1/5 of the members of both houses of Congress. The law also states that if a candidate does not concede by 5 days after the election, that the General Services Administration will provide both campaigns with the funds needed for transition until the election's outcome is clear. The GSA then will cut off funding for the losing campaign. Both the deficit and the debt are under constant scrutiny from the public, and with the never-ending threats of government shutdowns from raising the debt ceiling, it can certainly be tiring to experience. From a tax perspective, not much has changed under the Biden administration, as the Trump-era tax code will remain in effect until 2025. The Inflation Reduction Act did change the corporate tax rate for companies that make over $1 billion in 1 year to 15%. This is estimated to earn about $740 billion over the next 10 years through revenue raised from the corporate tax rate, healthcare cost savings, and money saved through IRS enforcements. The recently signed Social Security law of January of this year is also slated to add about $200 billion to the deficit over the next decade. The deficit is currently much lower than it was during the peak of COVID at about $3 trillion per year. It's now down to about $1.7 trillion, but is still significantly higher than that of 2019 before the pandemic of less than $1 trillion. Under Joe Biden's presidency, the debt has risen approximately $7 trillion, which is lower than the almost $8 trillion under President Trump. However, about half of this was done in the wake of COVID and government relief packages, and doesn't really make Biden's debt accumulation look much better in comparison. On the crime front, we'll divide Biden's term into 3 areas: legislative and executive orders, pardons and commutations, and the actual stats for crime during his term. On the legislative front, Biden signed the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act of 2022. This law makes lynching a federal crime and sets maximum sentences of up to 30 years when a conspiracy to commit a hate crime results in bodily harm or death. After failure to pass the George Floyd Police Reform Act, a federal police reform executive order would be issued on May 25th of 2022. The executive order directed the Attorney General to create a new national law enforcement accountability database with all federal law enforcement agencies required to participate. The database will include records of officers convicted of crimes, firings, and, quote, sustained complaints or records of disciplinary actions for serious misconduct, and it will be available to state and local agencies. Biden also signed the first major bipartisan firearms bill in decades on June 25th of 2022. It included $750 million for state-run crisis intervention programs, with the money to be used to implement and manage red flag programs and mental health courts, drug courts, and veterans courts. With the money to be used to implement and manage red flag programs and mental health courts, drug courts, and veterans courts. It also closed the boyfriend loophole, which barred individuals who have been convicted of domestic violence crimes against either spouses or partners with whom they shared children or partners with whom they cohabitated from having guns. It is now expanded to include intimate partners who may not live together, be married, or share children. The law bars anyone convicted of a domestic violence crime against someone they have a, quote, continuing serious relationship of a romantic or intimate nature, quote, from having a gun. It will allow anyone convicted of misdemeanor domestic violence crimes to restore their gun rights after 5 years if they don't commit any additional crimes. The bill encourages states to include juvenile records in the National Instant Criminal Background Check System and implements a new protocol for checking these records. The bill goes after anyone who sells guns as a primary source of income but did not register as a federally licensed firearm dealer. It will also increase funding for mental health programs and school security. While the law was far from the sweeping legislation Biden campaigned on, including an assault weapons ban, it's still a significant step forward to solving the epidemic of gun violence in America. In February of 2024, Biden would sign the End Fentanyl Act, which, quote, requires U.S. Customs and Border Protection to review and update manuals and policies related to inspections at ports of entry to ensure the effective detection of illegal smuggling of drugs and humans along the border, end quote. Biden wouldn't issue his first pardon or clemency until April of 2022. He pardoned a former Secret Service agent that had been accused of selling Secret Service files, but was convicted under dubious and potentially racially motivated circumstances. He also pardoned 2 individuals serving time for nonviolent drug offenses. Additionally, he would shorten the sentences of 75 individuals, many of whom were already on house arrest, citing shorter sentences under new drug laws as his motivation, as well as addressing the racial disparity in those federal prisons. In October of 2022, Biden issued a wide sweeping pardon for all federal offenses for simple marijuana possession. This seemed to be the first step toward decriminalization. On December 22nd of the following year, he issued an expansion adding attempted possession or simple usage. On December 30th of 2022, Biden pardoned 6 more individuals. 5 out of 6 of them committed drug offenses when they were younger than the age of 25, and the 6th being an 80-year-old woman who had murdered her abusive husband back when she was 33. He pardoned 11 more people committed of nonviolent drug offenses on December 22nd of 2023. On December 12th of 2024, Biden would grant the largest single-day clemency in history by commuting 1,500 sentences for those who were released to house arrest during the pandemic. He granted 39 full pardons to another group of people that had committed nonviolent drug offenses. On December 20th and January of 2025, Biden would break his own single-day clemency record by pardoning 2,500 nonviolent drug offenders, this time placing an emphasis on those convicted of crimes involving crack cocaine. He noted once again that the recent laws and disparities in crime sentences related to drugs were his motivation for doing so. On December 23, 2024, he pardoned 37 of the 40 federal death row inmates, with the exception being one of the Boston bombers, the shooter at the church in Charleston in 2015, and the 2018 shooter of a synagogue in Pittsburgh. He cited his long-standing principle against the death penalty, with the exceptions of mass shootings and hate crimes. In a general sense of crime, during the Biden administration, there have been a lot of conflicting narratives. It's important to take a look at as big a picture as possible when looking at stats or performance. It was announced in 2022 and 2023 that the FBI had undercounted some crime because preliminary crime stats come from incidents that are voluntarily reported to departments from all over the country, and it showed an increase in crime from 2021 to 2022. It is worth noting that crime is down from when Biden took office nationally, but the 2020 numbers were likely inflated from the pandemic-related crimes. The data shows that 2023 had essentially the same amount of crime as did 2019 before the pandemic. Property crimes did show slight increases. Both sides of the political aisle tend to pick specific time frames or locations when trying to make things look better or worse than they truly are, but in general sense, crime is more or less the same as it was 5 years ago in 2019. President Biden took many steps to aid the men and women that serve in the armed forces. He would often express his sympathy towards the families of deceased veterans, being the father of a deceased veteran himself, and he would make sure to end every speech with, on November 30th of 2021, 4 bills were passed seeking to...
May God protect our troops.
On November 30th of 2021, 4 bills were passed seeking to help correct disparities and benefits among different races for veterans, and to aid with the surviving families of deceased veterans with education costs and address the high maternal mortality rate among female veterans. In December of that year, he would issue a 2.7% wage increase, which would be a part of the 2022 defense spending budget. In March of 2022, the Pentagon budget announced that a 4.6% wage increase would be coming for troops and civilian workers, which was the largest in 2 decades. It is worth noting this larger than normal increase was in part to help with higher costs associated with inflation. Biden would sign the Honoring Our Pact Act of August of 2022 and expanded healthcare coverages for veterans exposed to burn pits, an issue close to the president's family after he lost his son Beau to cancer related to such exposures in 2015. The bill added new covered conditions and made application requirements easier, with it estimating that 3.5 million service members would be eligible after this change. An assist should be offered to Jon Stewart after his very fiery speech before Congress and his years of support, in particular with the first responders from the 9/11 terrorist attacks.
Tenacity, humility. 18 years later, do yours.
In December of 2023, another wage increase of 5.2%, which would be the highest since 2002, was announced for the following year. And most recently, in December of 2024, a wage increase of 14.5% for junior enlisted members would be announced, as well as a 4.5% increase for all others. All but Biden's first increase were higher than any given under Presidents Trump or Obama. In the last few weeks of his term, President Biden signed the Dole Act. This legislation tackled problems for veterans like housing, will offer Native American veterans home projects and purchases on tribal land, and authorizes the VA to provide grants for transitional housing for all veterans. It also increases funding for mental health care for veterans and increases coverages for those seeking care outside of traditional nursing homes by covering services at the same rate as nursing homes. It also covers ambulance rides to the VA and provides more options for veterans who need a caretaker, among a list of other health services. The Dole Act also includes improved education access through expanding scholarships and modernizing educational assistance tools. On top of the provisions that were previously mentioned in the American Rescue Plan, in April of 2022, Biden signed an executive order that aimed to expand the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid by lowering the cost for those with coverage through their employer and either program. It reduced paperwork and expanded access to new populations of people for both. The Inflation Reduction Act included a number of cost-saving measures, such as capping insulin costs for Medicare recipients to $35 per vial. It also includes a $2,000 annual out-of-pocket cap. The legislation also allows Medicare to negotiate drug prices on a list of certain prescription medications. Through an executive order issued in 2021, in August of 2022, the FDA finally made it possible for people to purchase hearing aids over the counter, a measure that is set to save thousands of dollars annually for those who need the devices. In December of 2022, the president signed the Medical Marijuana Research Act, which was designed to ease the process of product and medical research into marijuana by scientists by easing the registration process. This hopefully will lead to increased efficiency and faster results from said research. At the end of his presidency, the number of people with health insurance was at 300 million, or roughly 92%. At the end of his presidency, the number of people with health insurance was at 300 million, or roughly 92% of the American population, with the number of people enrolled under the Affordable Health Care Act doubling under his presidency. Next to the economy, the border has probably been the area of highest criticism for the Biden administration. This comes from extremely high numbers of illegal border crossings, which started right after his term in office began. In June of 2021, Biden revoked the Trump-era Remain in Mexico policy after initially pausing it, which required that Central American asylum seekers remain below the southern border pending their court case. The policy change would be blocked by federal judges, but was later reinstated by the Supreme Court, stating that federal laws give the government discretion in implementing changes to border policy. In the beginning of 2022, the Biden administration began using its pandemic-era authority to deport Venezuelan asylum seekers to Colombia without hearing their case. On two separate occasions in 2024, the House of Representatives passed a non-binding resolution denouncing the Biden administration's handling of the border. The first announcement came on January 17th, the second one coming shortly after Kamala Harris became the presumptive nominee for the 2024 election. It is worth noting here that Biden did task Harris with exploring the root causes of immigration and giving a report to address it, which she did in July of 2021. The report was quite brief, and it cited issues such as poverty and corruption as root causes for immigration, which would have been addressed in a proposed bill submitted during Biden's first day in office, as previously mentioned. A 2024 update showed the administration had spent about $30 billion in Central America attempting to combat these root causes. In May of 2024, the Senate blocked a border bill that had been negotiated by both Democrats and Republicans. The blockage came after President Trump called on fellow Republicans to not support the legislation during an election year. The bill, if passed, would set a year window where the president has the authority to shut down the border if certain numbers of crossings occur, with an automatic shutdown coming if they exceeded 5,000 a day for more than 7 days. Added funds to hire more border agents and to expedite the asylum process were also included. After this failed to pass, in June, Biden issued an executive order to shut down the border if crossings reached a daily average of 2,500 and would remain in effect until it fell down to 1,500 per day. He received very harsh criticism over this order, despite it causing a severe drop-off in crossings, given both the time of its implementation before an election, and that in theory the action could have been taken much earlier. In broad terms, Biden has deported more people during his term than Trump, but that's clearly due to the much higher number of crossings, which occurred from 2021 to 2023, which were about 3.5 times higher than that under Trump. As a proportion of illegal immigrants that crossed, Trump deported more than Biden. Scandals plague nearly all presidential terms, from extramarital affairs to corruption. There is usually some dirty laundry to be found belonging to the occupant of the Oval Office. Comparatively to his predecessor, Biden did not have as many, but he certainly was not without his fair share of blunders and consternation. In January of 2023, while the nation was reacting to the ongoing investigation into former President Trump's, shall we say, less than secure handling of classified materials, it was revealed that President Biden was also in possession of classified materials, these from his time as vice president, which he was also not authorized to have. Attorney General Merrick Garland announced on the 12th of that month, after documents were found in both Biden's homes, specifically in his garage, and in an office, that he would be appointing a special counsel to investigate the matter. Additional documents were found on the 20th. It is worth noting for the individuals looking to compare the two presidents in what on the surface appears to be a very similar circumstance, that Biden cooperated fully with the investigations and turned over any and all materials that were found, compared to President Trump, who refused to give up materials and instructed his lawyers to lie on multiple occasions until the FBI was forced to raid his Mar-a-Lago residence to retrieve them. Had he cooperated at any point before then, the FBI and the Justice Departments have both confirmed he would not have been charged. The Department of Justice announced it will not charge President Biden on February 8th of 2024, with Special Counsel Robert Hur stating, quote, "Our investigation uncovered evidence that President Biden willfully retained and disclosed classified materials after his vice presidency when he was a private citizen," end quote, but added the evidence, quote, "does not establish Mr. Biden's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt," end quote. He went on to say, quote, "We have also considered that at trial, Mr. Biden would likely present himself to a jury, as he did during our interview of him, as a sympathetic, well-meaning, elderly man with a poor memory," end quote. He would go on to note the results would have been the same even if Biden were not the sitting president. The documents would not be the only scandal Biden would be a part of. The president's son Hunter would be a constant source of controversy for him even before he took office as president. Specifically the laptop case that was withheld until after the 2020 election, and the gun charges brought against him in 2023. Hunter Biden was indicted on September 14th of 2023 for lying about his drug use while filling out forms and for possessing a weapon while using narcotics. Originally, a plea deal was put together, but later thrown out by a judge in what many perceived to be a politically motivated move, after congressional investigations could not provide any evidence of Biden's involvement with his son's business enterprises overseas. In December of last year, a former FBI informant was indicted for lying about supposed bribery schemes involving the Bidens. During an interview in June of this past year, President Biden said that he would not issue a pardon for his son if he were found guilty of the charges against him, and would accept the results of the trial. He would, however, issue an unconditional pardon to his son in December of last year. The timing is notable as it comes after President Trump's successful re-election. Biden noted that he felt his son had been, quote, singled out for being the son of the president and called the trial a, quote, miscarriage of justice. Staunch defenders of the president will note that he technically did not lie, considering the trial had not ended, but it is going to be a permanent mark on his term. For context, it is worth noting controversial pardons are not new. To name a few examples, President George H.W. Bush pardoned those involved in the Iran-Contra scandal after his defeat to Bill Clinton in 1992, who would also go on to controversially pardon his own brother. President Trump was also promised to pardon those convicted in their part on the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. Though as of the time of this recording, Vice President-elect J.D. Vance has started to walk back those remarks. There are a few miscellaneous acts that don't necessarily fit into any of the aforementioned categories that are worth discussing during the Biden term, so let's briefly look into those. Biden declassified a slew of 9/11 investigation documents on September 3rd of 2021, which all three of his predecessors declined to do. On December 15th of 2021, 1,500 documents pertaining to the JFK assassination were released, including one showing contacts with Russian officials up to a month before the assassination. In December of 2023, almost 13,000 additional documents would be released, marking 97% of all documents relating to the event being publicly available. 3,000 documents were fully or partially withheld. It is worth noting this is something President Trump promised to do and said he would do in his next term, despite this being done nearly a year beforehand.
But JFK in particular. So they call me, a lot of good people call me, people that that you would find reasonable people, and they asked me not to do it. So I said, well, we'll close it for another time.
In terms of vetoes, President Biden has been about as inactive as his two predecessors, issuing only about a dozen, with his first coming in March of 2023. The veto ended a Trump-era ban on federal managers of retirement plans, considering factors such as climate change and social impacts or pending lawsuits when making investment choices. He recently received criticism for vetoing the Judges Act, which would have expanded the federal judiciary over the next 3 presidential terms. This is likely to stop President Trump from appointing as many federal judges as possible, after Republicans took similar action against President Obama during his administration. United States citizens being held in other countries is a constant source of public upheaval. As of a July 2024 report, there were 46 citizens being held in 16 different countries, with estimated 78% of them being wrongfully detained. This is down from the peak of 2022 by about 42%. Since that time, even more citizens have been released. Let's take a look at the releases President Biden has been able to secure. On October 2nd of 2022, an exchange took place for 7 Americans held in Venezuela, in exchange for 2 relatives of Venezuelan President Maduro. This includes 5 oil executives, a United States Marine, and 1 additional citizen. In September of 2023, 5 citizens, including one that had been there for almost 8 years, were freed from captivity in Iran in exchange for the unfreezing of $6 billion in seized oil revenue and 5 Iranians held in America. On August 1st of 2024, a massive prisoner exchange took place. 24 prisoners from 7 countries were exchanged, including the release of 16 individuals held in Russia, 4 of which were included Americans, specifically 2 journalists, 1 Marine, and a permanent Russian-American citizen who was a very vocal critic of Vladimir Putin. The deal took 2 years to work out and required cooperation, in particularly from Germany, who was holding a key figure for the deal, Russian prisoner Vadim Kryzakov, a high-ranking member of Russian intelligence. In November of the same year, 3 U.S. citizens, one of which had been held for over 3,000 days, were exchanged for unnamed Chinese nationals. As of January of 2025, the administration was in talks with Afghanistan for the release of citizens that were being held there. In total, during the term of Joe Biden, 21 American citizens have been detained by foreign countries, and he has freed 19, 6 of which were taken during his term, the other 13 being taken under President Trump. Now let's turn our attention to specific foreign policy taken against different nations individually. Iran has been at the center of foreign relations for the better part of 3 decades. After Trump's withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal, Biden had explored options to rejoin it. In 2023, Iran was making tens of billions more dollars due to higher oil exports. This is combined with the U.S. unfreezing $6 billion in funds that Iran was now able to access through a prisoner exchange, and multiple renewals of sanctions waivers, allowing access to $10 billion in frozen funds from Iraq. Many have claimed that these funds have aided in the support of Hamas in attacking Israel. On January 2, 2025, it was announced the Biden administration had been discussing potential attacks against nuclear sites in Tehran if progress continued to be made toward the creation of a nuclear weapon. The threshold for attack was noted at 90% uranium purity, although other officials in the White House have denied such plans exist. It's no secret that the event that has plagued the Biden administration since before it even took office is the withdrawal of the United States troops from Afghanistan. It was a campaign pledge of Biden's during 2020. President Biden often takes the blame for the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, especially after 13 servicemen were killed during an explosion on August 26, 2021. It also injured about 100 others. Videos of people climbing onto trains and aircraft circulated all over the world, and after Biden stated that the Taliban would not take over in the near future, that turned out to be immediately wrong, as they took city after city. The whole event seemed like a total loss. Let's take a look at the Afghan withdrawal, how it started, and how much of it is to blame on President Biden. Back on February 29th of 2020, then President Trump signed a deal with the Taliban that would mark the terms of the United States to have all troops withdrawn by May 1st of 2021. At the time, the conditions were not made available in full. Trump would later say in a speech that the withdrawal was contingent on, quote, the Taliban's action against al-Qaeda and other terrorists who could threaten us. At the time of the agreement, there were estimated to be 13,000 troops in Afghanistan. The agreement included the release of 5,000 Taliban fighters held by Afghanistan's government, who, oddly enough, were not a part of this deal. On March 1st, President Ghani made strong objection to this by stating, quote, freeing Taliban prisoners is not under the authority of America, but the authority of the Afghan government. There has been no commitment for the release of 5,000 prisoners. The Senate was told by General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that the Taliban agreed to not attack American troops or coalition forces, or to launch high-profile attacks on any of the capitals of the Afghan provinces. The Taliban would, however, attack Afghan troops in Helmand province, and the U.S. responded with an airstrike. After much pressure, President Ghani agreed to release 1,500 Taliban fighters out of a rate of 100 per day starting on March 10th. Despite further escalation of violence, which was a condition of the agreement according to the U.S. officials, from the Taliban, it was reported that in May of 2020, 4,000 troops had been removed. On August 18th, a report covering activity in Afghanistan from April to June from the Defense Department's Inspector General's office said, quote, the Taliban did not appear to uphold its commitment to distance itself from terrorist organizations in Afghanistan. UN and U.S. officials reported that the Taliban continued to support al-Qaeda and conducted joint attacks with al-Qaeda's members against Afghan national defense and security forces, end quote. On September 3rd, the final Taliban prisoners were released by the Afghanistan government. After 7 months of delays, the Taliban and Afghan officials met for peace talks on September 12th. The Taliban continued its attacks. On September 16th, it was reported that the, quote, Taliban attacks in 3 provinces across North Afghanistan since Tuesday killed at least 17 people, including 6 civilians, and wounded scores of others, even as a Taliban political team was negotiating peace with Afghanistan.
So we're having some very good discussions with the Taliban, as you probably heard. It's been public.
November 16th, after Trump's defeat in the 2020 election, congressional Republicans chimed in after a report of rapid troop withdrawals, with Senator Marco Rubio speaking on a, quote, Saigon type of situation, end quote, and Senator Majority Leader Mitch McConnell stating, quote, a rapid withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan now would hurt our allies and delight the people who wish us harm, end quote. The following day, Acting Secretary of Defense Miller made the formal announcement that troops would be down to 2,500 by January 15th of 2021. That same day, a report came from the Department of Defense's Inspector General that, quote, at the same time, the Taliban increased its attacks against Afghan forces, leading to distressingly high levels of violence that could threaten the peace agreement, end quote. On December 2nd, peace talks resumed after falling apart between the Taliban and Afghan governments, while violence continued to escalate. The Department of Defense's Inspector General issued a statement on the Taliban not fulfilling their end of the withdrawal agreement, saying, quote, this withdrawal was contingent on the Taliban abiding by its commitments under the agreement, which include not allowing terrorists to use Afghanistan soil to threaten the United States and its allies. However, it was unclear whether the Taliban was in compliance with the agreement, as members of al-Qaeda were integrated into the Taliban's leadership and command structure, end quote. The day the troop level hit 1,500, the Afghan vice president stated in a BBC interview that the Trump administration was too lenient with the Taliban. Quote, I am telling the United States as a friend and as an ally that trusting the Taliban without putting in a verification mechanism is going to be a fatal mistake, end quote. Adding that Afghanistan leaders warned the United States that violence will spike as the 5,000 Taliban prisoners were released. Violence has spiked, he added. On February 13, 2021, a report from the Congressional Afghanistan Study Group, which was commissioned in 2019, made recommendations to alter the withdrawal agreement, stating, quote, the most important revision is to ensure that a complete withdrawal of U.S. troops is based not on an inflexible timeline, but on all parties fulfilling their commitments, including the Taliban making good on its promises to contain terrorist groups and reduce violence against the Afghan people, and making compromises to achieve a political settlement, end quote. On February 19th, Biden reaffirmed the commitment to bring all troops home. Secretary of State Antony Blinken told President Ghani on March 7th that even with future financial assistance from the United States, that he was, quote, concerned that the security situation will worsen and the Taliban could make rapid territorial gains, end quote. On March 25th, the commander of the U.S. Special Operations Command, General Richard Clark, told the Senate Armed Services Committee, quote, it is clear that the Taliban have not upheld what they said they would do and reduce the violence. While they have not attacked United States forces, it is clear they took a deliberate approach and increased their violence since the peace accords were signed, end quote. The same day, Biden discussed the difficulty of meeting the May 1st deadline. On April 14th, he stated all troops would be removed by September 11th. The following day, the Taliban issued a statement that the United States failing to be withdrawn by May 1st, quote, opens the way for the Taliban to take every necessary countermeasure, hence the American side will be held responsible for all future consequences, end quote. On April 18th, President Trump stated that Biden should stick to the May 1st deadline, or as close as possible. The DoD's Inspector General reported on May 18th that the first quarter of 2021 saw 37% more violence than the same time last year, and that the Taliban and al-Qaeda were preparing for, quote, large-scale offenses. The same day, the United States Special Representative for Afghan Reconciliation said a Taliban takeover will result in a long war as the Afghan Special Forces and people, quote, will fight. This statement is not without context, as the Afghan people historically have resisted takeover from hostile entities such as the Russians in the 1970s and 80s. On June 8th, the Taliban spokesman made clear their goal to establish an Islamic government. On July 6th, it was confirmed that Bagram Airfield, the largest in the country, had been withdrawn from. 2 days later, on the 8th, President Biden moved the withdrawal date up to the 31st of August after stating the Taliban, quote, is at its strongest militarily since 2001, end quote. He also said a takeover, quote, is not inevitable, adding, the likelihood there's going to be the Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country is highly unlikely, end quote. At a rally on the 24th, despite all evidence to the contrary, Trump said regarding his relationship with the Taliban leader, the two had, quote, a real understanding. The Taliban would take over its first province on August 6th in another violation of the U.S. agreement. On the 15th, the Taliban entered the capital of Kabul and President Ghani fled the country. The United States evacuated all diplomats from the embassy via helicopter. The following day, Biden stated in an address to the nation, quote, the truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we anticipated. So what happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometimes without trying to fight. The president would also say, if anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending United States military involvement in Afghanistan was now the right decision, end quote. So, what is the takeaway from all this? Well, it seems that the Biden administration was placed in a no-win situation. The agreement was negotiated between the United States and an entity that was not the recognized sovereign government in Afghanistan. It was then given a short deadline to meet upon a news administration taking office. The agreement was not held up to by the Taliban, say the condition to not attack U.S. forces before the Biden administration even took office. So why would anyone think that they would after? They constantly increased violence, took over territory, and in the end did kill American servicemen. In the end, the Taliban acted like the extremist organization that it is. The only solace to be taken from the whole endeavor is that, after nearly 2 decades, the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan did come to an end. Almost a year to the date that the U.S. left Afghanistan, al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri, who took over after the death of Osama bin Laden, was killed in the capital of Kabul on August 1st of 2022. In terms of the rest of the Middle East, in June of 2021, it was announced that the United States would be removing a number of missile systems from several countries in the Middle East to reduce its general presence in the area. On January 30th of 2024, President Biden authorized drone strikes in Jordan in response to the killing of 3 American troops in a wave of attacks on American forces that began after the Hamas attacks on October 7th of 2023. Speaking of Israel being one of the United States' key allies is always a focal point of foreign relations. President Biden was awarded Israel's Presidential Medal of Honor on July 14th, 2022. Unfortunately, the near 80-year war between Palestinians and Israel over the rightful owners of the lands would flare up again as Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, 2023, killing 1,200 people and taking 250 hostages. After the attacks, the Israeli Special Forces began retaliatory attacks on Hamas, which often led to the deaths of civilians. This was because Hamas would often hide in civilian areas. This sparked outrage and protests throughout the world, and after months of aid, President Biden called for Israel not to fight if they can't protect the citizens on February 11th of 2024. 9 days later, on the 20th, after the deaths of nearly 30,000 Palestinians by Israeli forces, the United States issued what would be its 3rd veto of a United Nations Security Council ceasefire resolution. The reason for the veto being that the United States felt it would make it hard to bring into peace talks and lift restrictions to bring in humanitarian aid. The United States would begin to airdrop supplies to Gaza on March 2nd of 2024 after Israeli military fired upon 100 Palestinians, killing them in an attempt to raid food from delivery trucks. Nearly 40,000 meals would be dropped, with more scheduled to follow. President Biden issued a statement denouncing Israel on April 2nd after 7 aid workers were killed distributing food in Gaza, where the president again said Israel was not doing enough to protect its citizens. He would also issue a statement denouncing the Iranian strike against Israel on April 13th and move forces to help Israel intercept nearly all incoming missiles. Biden would pause some weapons shipments in May and threaten to withhold aid altogether if Israel did not take more immediate action to protect civilians, noting that the weapons sent from the United States had been used in such practices against them. The president would issue a statement of condemnation against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on September 2nd after 6 hostages were killed. The United States would issue a 4th UN Security Council ceasefire. On January 15th, almost the essential last functioning day of his administration, Biden finally achieved the ceasefire deal he was looking for between Israel and Hamas. The deal spent 8 months in negotiation and finally came to fruition, and specifically includes the release from Hamas of 33 hostages in exchange for 100 Palestinian prisoners with life sentences, according to the information released by Hamas. Israel will also release 1,000 Palestinian prisoners who were not involved in the October 7th attacks, and an unspecified number of Palestinian prisoners will also be released abroad or in Gaza. Under the agreement, the Israeli forces will also withdraw to the Gaza border, allowing the displaced Palestinians to return to their homes, and for transfers of hostages and prisoners. A large amount of humanitarian aid will also be shipped, and hospitals and healthcare centers will be rebuilt. This is obviously a massive achievement. The deal has been criticized by some for not being strict enough, but it is important to note that this deal took months and months of negotiations, and no matter what the details may specifically have been, a ceasefire is still a happy result nonetheless. President Trump did try to claim some credit for the deal, which he may or may not deserve considering his strong rhetoric toward the situation, but it definitely echoes back to the 1980 Iran hostage crisis, which ended right before President Carter left office on his last day. The country probably at the top of most Americans' list of concerns in relation to opposition to the United States is probably China. From their disregard for human rights to accusations of business abuse practices against America and her business, China's relations with the United States have been rocky to say the least. In June of 2021, Biden would issue an executive order banning investment in 59 Chinese firms, including the popular phone brand Huawei. This expanded the list of 31 previously issued under President Trump. Biden would then sign the Uyghur Forces Labor Prevention Act on December 23rd of that same year, which seeks to prevent goods used from forced labor in China from entering the United States' markets. In the first conversation with Chinese leader Xi Jinping in over a year, Biden announced that new communication channels would be opened, as well as measures to counter fentanyl between the two countries on November 15th of 2023. Although maintaining the position that the United States does not recognize Taiwan as independent, President Biden approved over $500 million in aid to Taiwan in September of 2024 as military tensions with China continue to escalate. NATO is a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it's a military partnership between currently 32 member nations. It was created in the wake of World War II as a cooperative protection network, and the member states work together to provide for the collective good of the other nations and the world at large. And despite the cooperation in this way, sometimes countries still face rough patches with each other, particularly on military issues. Tensions with France arose in September of 2021 after the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia entered into an agreement to provide Australia with nuclear submarines, a deal for which they were about to finalize with France. France's President Emmanuel Macron said the issue would widen an already sizable gap between the nations and that would implement, quote, strategic autonomy. It would later be reported that the French government was notified only hours beforehand of the deal. In August of 2022, Biden would ratify documents to bring Finland and Sweden to NATO, which brought the total to its current number of 32. On July 27th of 2023, Biden hosted Italy's new Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. This came after months of criticism and skepticism from President Biden, after his fear of what the newly elected far-right government would do. This would essentially come to an end, as upon taking office, the new Italian leader would shift her harsh rhetoric and policies, particularly on gay rights and immigration, more to the center. In February of 2022, after months of tensions, including the buildup of 200,000 Russian troops around the Ukrainian border, Russia finally invaded. The invasion came after decades of tensions between Russia and Ukraine, most recently the idea of Ukraine joining with NATO. Before the invasion, Biden had tried to de-escalate the situation by calling Vladimir Putin at the end of 2021 and again at the beginning of 2022. The UN Security Council called sessions along with various NATO leaders, and President Biden's immediate response was to condemn Putin and name him as the aggressor. He implemented a variety of financial sanctions against Russia and deployed troops to Germany, but maintained none would be sent to Ukraine. Over the course of the next 2 years, multiple aid packages will be approved to help Ukraine, with the first coming in March of 2022. This sent over $13 billion in refugee and military aid to the embattled nation. In May of that year, Biden would sign the Ukraine Democracy Defense Lend-Lease Act, which aimed to streamline the process of sending military aid to Ukraine. This was similar to Lend-Lease Acts implemented during World War II. In January of the following year, the United States sent Abrams tanks, enough to create an entire fighting battalion, to Ukraine to help in their battle. In total, approximately $180 billion has been sent under the Biden administration in aid to Ukraine, with roughly $100 billion going directly to aid the Ukrainian government, and the other $80 billion funding organizations in the United States, and a small portion aiding small countries in the region surrounding Ukraine. As of January 2025, Russia has still failed to successfully conquer Ukraine and its determined people. As a result of their actions, over 200,000 Russian soldiers have been killed, their economy is in turmoil, and they have been expelled by the rest of the world. Spending for NATO as of June of 2024 was at 2% of GDP for 20 of the 32 member nations, doubling the previous number when Biden took office. This increase is without a doubt due to the Ukrainian-Russian war, but does relieve some criticism that the United States is the only nation paying its, quote, fair share. In January this year, President Trump called to raise the spending to 5% of GDP, with NATO announcing that this likely would not happen, but spending would likely exceed its current levels. Outside the realms of Asia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East, foreign policy has been comparatively more relaxed. Biden would issue some sanctions directly on Venezuelan officials that interfered in their most recent election in September of last year. The Biden re-election campaign has been notably rough, to say the least. With approval ratings precipitously falling for over 2 years, it was always going to be an uphill battle. A re-election announcement was made on April 25th of 2023. It was not looking good for Biden heading into the first debate against President Trump, with his approval ratings falling severely since September of 2021, from its peak of 55% down to just 37%. On top of that, there were many calls for Biden to step down. This stemmed from low polling in some states, double digits to Trump, and due to his age, which by the debate was showing much more than it had in early years of his term, or even as recently as his last State of the Union. Biden maintained that he was staying in the race. During the debate, Biden looked confused, he sounded weak, and he stumbled a lot, even by the standards of the GAF.
So let's build the future together. Let's remember who we are. We are the United States of America. And there is nothing beyond our capacity.
Biden maintained that he was staying in the race. During the debate, Biden looked confused, he sounded weak, and he stumbled a lot, even by the standards of the GAF machine himself.
Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Thank you, President Biden. President Trump?
After the debate, calls for Biden to step down increased exponentially. Celebrities and Democrat politicians alike called for him to step down. During all this, at rallies and during a primetime ABC interview, President Biden stayed dedicated to staying in the race. Despite his many statements to stick it out, Biden would announce on Twitter that he would withdraw from the race on July 21st, leaving Vice President Kamala Harris to be the presumptive nominee. Her campaign, while it did much better than Biden in terms of polling and setting fundraising records, was of course unsuccessful as she failed to galvanize the 2020 voters that elected Biden, and Trump would be the winner of the 2024 election. This was a not too dissimilar result to the end of a couple of different presidential terms, specifically Truman, who despite great economic times, minus some high inflation, and a well-off country, left office with the lowest approval ratings in American history, and President Carter, who, like President Biden, took over at a time where no matter their actions, they were to be plagued with economic and foreign issues outside their control that would negatively alter the public perception of their campaigns, no matter how much successful legislation they passed. So what are going to be the long-term impacts of the presidency of Joe Biden? Well, along with a slew of game-changing legislation, President Biden left his mark in other areas of American life. Biden has many administrative firsts, of course with the first female and person of color to serve as the vice president, but he also appointed the first female Secretary of Treasury, the first African-American Secretary of Defense, and many other historic cabinet appointments. Biden appointed the first African-American woman to the Supreme Court, with Justice Ketanji Jackson being approved in April of 2022. In broad terms of the judiciary, Biden appointed over 235 appointees during his term, which narrowly beat out the record set during Trump's term of 234. And in July of last year, he even introduced proposals to reform the Supreme Court, including ethics committees and term limits, which most of the American people are in favor of. President Biden made Juneteenth a federal holiday on June 17, 2021, and Biden would be the first president to issue a formal apology to Native Americans on October 25th of last year for the abuse caused by the government-funded boarding schools in the 19th century. He would even officially designate the bald eagle as the official national bird on Christmas Eve of 2024, which seemingly all Americans were stunned to find out had not already been done. So how do we grade the Biden presidency? To try to do this as objectively as possible, let's look at a few things. 1. Did he fulfill his campaign promises, or at least attempt to? Biden has fully fulfilled about a third of the promises he made in the 2020 campaign, including not raising taxes for individuals over $400,000 a year in income, get the COVID pandemic under control, and expand the Affordable Care Act. Biden has made compromises on about a third of his promises as well, including reducing the infant mortality rate, which he has taken actions toward and may take time to see benefits, Social Security expansions, and Veterans Affairs. He failed on the final third of his promises, such as updating the Voting Rights Act, ending super PACs, and free college for all despite canceling billions in student debt. In terms of where the country is from January 20th, 2021 to today, hopefully this presentation has given you some insight to make that judgment for yourselves. But it is beyond denial that the pandemic is over, the economy is objectively stronger than it was before, more people are employed, and America has upheld its commitment to help its friends abroad. Was it perfect? Certainly not. Even Biden himself has recently stated that he was likely not going to be up to the task of being president at age 86. Is Joe Biden the best president of all time? No. Not even close. And to make such a statement would be as absurd as to say he's the worst of all time. In February of 2024, Biden was ranked 14th by presidential historians. This is likely in part due to recency bias, as they ranked Donald Trump in last place, which that distinction will always belong to Andrew Johnson. But it is not out of the question that Joe Biden's probably in the top half. For those interested in my meager opinion, I would say that the Biden presidency overall was a success. And it's hard to imagine that someone with experience as a lawyer, 36 years in the Senate, many of which as a high-ranking committee member, and 8 years as vice president, would fail given all that experience. His time in Congress clearly gave him an ability unprecedented in recent times to work across the aisle and achieve bipartisan support where many thought impossible. And his time on the Foreign Relations Committee and as vice president allowed for unparalleled experience he would carry into the White House. Biden was not the president America deserved, but certainly the president that America needed. It's hard to say how history will remember these last 4 years, but I think given the turnaround in public perception that nearly if not all presidents seem to receive after leaving office, that it's very likely, if not the last 4 years, the last 81 of Joe Biden's life will become as implanted in the hearts of the American people as those of Harry Truman, Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush, and all the other men that have been a member of the very exclusive club of President of the United States. I'd like to thank all of you that have taken the time to watch this deep dive into the presidency of Joe Biden. If you feel I've earned it, please consider subscribing and sharing this video around. In the next presidential deep dive, we'll be taking a look at the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, and until then, remember, never stop learning.